When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Aloe or Allbirds, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and great marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling, and for shoppers, buying, simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. Nobody does online business better than Shopify. It's home of Shop Pay, the #1 checkout in the world. You can use it to boost conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going through to checkout. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to upgrade your selling today. That's shopify.com/income.
This episode is brought to you by State Farm. You might say all kinds of stuff when things go wrong, but these are the words you really need to remember. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. They've got options to fit your unique insurance needs, meaning you can talk to your agent to choose the coverage you need, have coverage options to protect the things you value most, file a claim right on the State Farm mobile app, and even reach a real person when you need to talk to someone. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there.
Before I get started, I did want to issue a warning that there is a brief mention of a non-consensual crime committed against a minor that may be difficult for some listeners. Once I mention the Russian delegation around the 14 or 15 minute mark, if you'd like to skip 2 minutes ahead, please feel free to do so. The Presidencies of the United States is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network.
You are now, my dear sir, about to retire from an arduous but glorious career, followed by the grateful recollections of a free and virtuous people whose security and felicity you have in an eminent degree promoted, and by the affectionate regards of those faithful friends who witnessed the gigantic difficulties you had to encounter and the fortitude and ability with which they were surmounted.
I take this method of bidding you a last farewell and of thanking you for the benefit I have derived as one of the citizens of the United States from your able and faithful services in some of the most important stations in the gift of a free people. At your time of life, repose is desirable and almost necessary. In retirement, I wish you all the happiness that you can derive from the reflection on a life spent for the benefit of your country rather than for your own. With the greatest respect, I remain your very humble servant.
On the prosperous condition of our country, which has succeeded a conflict rendered peculiarly severe and peculiarly glorious by contingent events as flattering to our adversaries as they were unlooked for by either party, I cordially unite in your congratulations, as well as in the hope that all the lessons afforded by the past may contribute to the future security and increase of the blessings we now enjoy. Through the remaining days of a life hitherto employed with little intermission in the public services, which you so much overvalue, my heart will cherish the affectionate sentiments which the representatives of my native state have addressed to me, and will offer its fervent prayers for the public prosperity and individual happiness of its citizens.
William Jones.
Isaac Griffin.
James Madison.
As March 4th, 1817 drew ever closer, Madison and his cabinet worked to wrap up their business so that they could hand off a solid government to the 5th U.S. president. However, unlike Madison's predecessor, this president did not intend to phone in his last few months in power. James Madison, the father of the Constitution, knew that he was responsible for leading the executive branch of government until his last moment in office, and he would continue to advance his agenda until then, as we shall see. Before I get to that, though, I'd like to welcome you to the Presidencies of the United States. I'm your host, Jerry Landry. Special thanks to Alex of the Vice Presidency Special Series, Greg Gassman of the Popular History Podcast, and Cody of the Imperfect Men Podcast for reading the opening quotes for this episode. In case you missed it, we offer a couple of special series here on Presidencies. one of which examines the lives, careers, and legacies of the 50 people to date who have served as Vice President of the United States. In addition to inspiring me to start the Presidency's podcast to begin with and be my partner in life, Alex graciously volunteered to join me for the Vice Presidency special series. To date, we've covered 5 vice presidents and 2 presidents pro tempore who took over the VP's role of presiding over the Senate, as well as occasionally being next in line for the presidency when there's a vacancy in the vice presidency, which happened more often than you would think. It's been a great journey thus far, and I hope you'll join Alex and me for that if you haven't already. As the name suggests, on Greg's podcast, Popular History, you can learn more about the popes and the Catholic Church. If you like some of the detail and exploration of lesser-known figures that we do here on presidencies, Greg has you covered. He even has a special series called Cardinal Numbers, where he's looking to rank all the cardinals of the Catholic Church. Search for Popular History. It's like popular, but with the Pope, wherever you get your podcast, or check out the page for this episode on my website for a link. Last, but certainly not least, Cody and his co-host Stephen on the Imperfect Men podcast are examining the lives, careers, and legacies of the signers of the founding documents of the United States, the Continental Association, the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the Constitution. Regular listeners of presidencies will recognize some names like John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, and Elbridge Gerry, but they also explore in more detail folks that we only touch on, such as Benjamin Franklin, William Dewar, and John Dickinson. As with Popular History, I'll have a link to Cody's podcast on my website, presidenciespodcast.com, or you can search for Imperfect Men on your podcast app of choice.
Every day, thousands of Comcast engineers and technologists, like Kunle, put people at the heart of everything they create.
In the average household, there are dozens of connected devices. Here in the Comcast family, we're building an integrated in-home Wi-Fi solution for millions of families like my own. It brings people together in meaningful ways.
Kunle and his team are building a Wi-Fi experience that connects 1 billion devices every year. Learn more about how Comcast is redefining the future of connectivity at comcastcorporation.com/Wi-Fi.
Representative Artemus Ward, Federalist from Massachusetts, had bemoaned in March 1814 the enlargement of the Army and argued in a speech to Congress that Madison intended, quote, to change the form of government, asserting that, quote, executive patronage and executive influence are truly alarming. It was true that the government that Madison prepared to hand over looked much different than that which he had taken the reins of in 1809. The realities of war had necessitated a growth in government and a refinement of processes and structure of the nation's military. However, Madison had not been alone in reshaping the American government in his 8 years as president. On March 20th, 1816, the Supreme Court handed down a decision in the case of Martin v. Hunter's Lessee, a case which had its roots in the American Revolution. The case involved claims to lands that had been seized from a loyalist, Thomas Lord Fairfax, during the Revolutionary War by act of the state of Virginia. However, the importance of this case was not necessarily the ruling on the specifics of the case, which did find for the Fairfax interest in a 6-0 ruling with Chief Justice John Marshall, who had a personal interest in the case, recusing himself. Rather, the primary long-lasting impact of this case's ruling lay in Associate Justice William Story's written opinion, which addressed a claim by the Virginia judiciary, quote, that they were under no obligation to obey the U.S. Supreme Court, which had already ruled in this case in 1813, also in the Fairfax interest's favor. After the original ruling, the folks who held title after the seizure tried again in Virginia courts, and judges in the Old Dominion had refused to recognize either the Fairfax claim or the Supreme Court's ruling. Justice Story in Martin v. Hunter's Lessee confirmed that the federal judiciary in general and the Supreme Court in particular had the authority to review state judicial rulings, quote, where federal statutes or treaties were involved, or when a state statute or common law rule had been upheld, though challenged under the federal Constitution. This ruling affirmed that, as with legislation, federal judicial rulings could overrule state rulings. The last year of Madison's presidency also saw a restoration of ties that had been broken. John Quincy Adams had officially taken up his post as U.S. Minister to Britain on June 8, 1815, when he was received by the Prince Regent to present his credentials. But it would take time for his British counterpart to arrive at his new posting in Washington. The new British minister to the U.S. was the 34-year-old Charles Bagot, the second son of Baron Bagot. Though his father was a new member of the British peerage, due to his tenure in the House of Commons, he was well connected, and the young Charles worked to build on those connections, marrying the niece of General Arthur Wellesley, better known by his later title as the Duke of Wellington. In 1807, thanks to his connections, Bagot secured a prominent position in the Foreign Office when George Canning took over as Foreign Secretary under the ministry of the Duke of Portland. This ministry, however, would prove to be not long-lived, and thus Bagot was out of public service a couple of years later. With his father-in-law joining the Liverpool government in 1814, and with the end of the war with America, Bagot was tapped to become the new British minister to the U.S. on the same day that Adams presented his credentials. His hopes for this new posting, however, were tempered by a warning from Canning that, quote, "I'm afraid, indeed, that the question is not so much how you will treat them, i.e., the Americans, as how they will treat you. And the hardest lesson which a British minister has to learn in America is not what to do, but what to bear." It would take some time before Bagot could leave for the U.S., as the ship that he was supposed to sail on was short-handed, and his wife was pregnant. But finally, in early January 1816, Charles and Mary Bagot, with their children, departed from Portsmouth, bound for America. On March 18th, they arrived in Washington, D.C. and, quote, took up residence at Crawford's Hotel, while a mansion in the present 24th and L Streets was prepared. Now, it should be remembered that Washington was still recovering from the British invasion only a year and a half prior, and thus the Bagots were greeted by scores of ruins and continuing rebuilding efforts as they rolled into town. Bagot met Secretary of State Monroe for the first time on March 20th, then the next afternoon was introduced to President Madison. As he had been warned by Canning, a few days after officially taking up his post, Bagot received a communication from a State Department clerk about, quote, new rules of official etiquette differing significantly from the earlier ones in which Bagot had been instructed in England. While the Bagots would be given, quote, precedence at dinners in their honor, otherwise, both senators and cabinet members would take precedence. Unlike his predecessor Anthony Merry during the Jefferson administration, Bagot took this in stride and did all he could to get in the good graces of the leading figures of the administration, even being sure to be overheard remarking that Dolly Madison, quote, looked every inch a queen. Bagot soon took to his new role, reporting back that the American capital was, quote, a much better city than I expected, and that though his ministerial role was, quote, a very arduous and responsible one, it was, quote, much greater than I conceived when I was in England. Thankfully for Monroe and the State Department, the new British minister was so amenable, for they had their hands full in 1816 with other diplomatic kerfuffles, starting with the new French minister to the U.S., Baron Jean-Guillaume Hyde de Neuville. As described by Monroe biographer Harry Ammond, despite having spent 5 years in the U.S. in exile, Neuville, quote, behaved in such a blustering and overbearing manner that he seemed determined to create a rift between France and the United States. To be fair, in the shift back and forth between French governments, there were still some in the U.S. who had established relations with or favored the Napoleonic regime versus the restored Bourbon government, which put Neuville in an awkward position. Neuville had originally planned to attend a 4th of July celebration in Baltimore, but Secretary of State Monroe warned him against participating in an event that would be attended by exiled Napoleonic generals. Particularly galling from the event was a toast made by the postmaster of Baltimore, John S. Skinner, in which he referred to French King Louis XVIII as, quote, an imbecile tyrant. Neuville lodged a protest with Monroe and demanded Skinner's dismissal from office, but Monroe pushed back, asserting that Skinner was guaranteed freedom of speech under the Constitution, and also noting that, given his low-ranking position in the federal bureaucracy, his remarks could not be seen as reflecting anything about government policy. If Neuville presented a headache to the Secretary of State, though, the Russian delegation posed an even more delicate and agonizing problem. The Russian Consul General in Philadelphia, Nikolai Kozlov, or as he's been referred to in a more anglicized version of his name, Nicholas Koslov, was arrested in early November 1815, quote, for raping a 12-year-old servant girl. Now, while you, like me, am likely thinking, good riddance, he should be arrested, there was the matter of diplomatic immunity to consider, which does not have any caveats for the type of crime committed by the diplomat. For the part of Russian minister to the U.S. Andrei Dashkov, he considered Kozlov's arrest to be a violation of his diplomatic rights and immediately lodged a protest. Not stopping with the Madison administration, Dashkov, quote, sent a circular letter of protest to other foreign missions in the United States in order to get their support. Ultimately, the administration's hands were tied, as Dashkov was technically correct. Thus, after securing Kozlov's release, the Madison administration, quote, formally apologized to Russia for Kozlov's arrest and confirmed, quote, the principle of consular immunity. This did not mean, however, that there wouldn't be consequences for both Dashkov and Kozlov. Russian Tsar Alexander decided in November 1816, quote, that Dashkov's personal relations with the United States were ill-suited for strengthening the good feeling that characterizes the mutual relations of the two states. Thus, orders were sent for the recall of both the Russian minister and the consul general. Dashkov, at the very least, would not leave immediately, as it would take until March 1819 for his successor to arrive to relieve him. Though the principle of diplomatic immunity prevents the host country from prosecuting diplomats, in certain severe cases, there is sometimes an expectation that their country of origin will take action. In the case of Kozlov, however, I did not see anything in my research to indicate that any further action was taken against him, or that any further attempts to secure justice for his victim were made. It could be that there was more to this than I was able to find, but the diplomatic recall was where the history ended in the sources I found. At least in the short term, the outgoing Madison administration could move past this shameful incident. The diplomatic scope of the nation was changing as Madison readied himself to hand over the presidency. When we last left Simón Bolívar and his forces in episode 4.33, they were proceeding down into the valley of Mérida in the spring of 1813 for a battle to the death with Spanish forces in modern-day Venezuela. During the summer, he continued to press forward towards the Venezuelan capital in a military action dubbed the Admirable Campaign, pushing the Spanish back with each victory. By the beginning of August, Bolívar was meeting with the Spanish commander to discuss the terms of surrender. Despite his decree of war to the death, Bolívar offered the Spanish favorable terms, a pardon and a promise of safe passage in exchange for a peaceful transfer of power. As he wrote in a letter to the people of Caracas, he wanted, quote, to show the world that even in victory, the noble Americans reject rancor and offer mercy. On August 6th, Bolívar entered Caracas, the triumphal hero. Soon enough, he was being proclaimed El Liberador, the liberator. This, however, was not the end of the conflict, as not everyone in Venezuela rallied around Bolívar's leadership. The eastern part of Venezuela was still controlled by a general named Santiago Marino, and it soon became apparent that, in order to fight the civil war, Bolívar would need more authority. Thus, on January 2, 1814, he called for a public assembly where he first practiced what would become a common move in his playbook. In order to secure more power, Bolívar proclaimed that he was not worthy to continue in his current role, resigned, and then was, quote, implored to take it, i.e., his role, back. It was through this means that Bolívar became the dictator of the Second Republic of Venezuela. While it's beyond our scope to go into all the details of the Spanish-American Wars of Independence, just know that 1814 saw Bolivar faced with setback after setback. Mariño would ultimately join Bolivar, but both of them would then face José Tomás Bovez's loyalist forces, dubbed the Legions of Hell. Bovez would take Caracas on July 16th and then continue to pursue Bolivar and Mariño's Republican forces. By the end of 1814, 80,000 Republicans were dead, and the Venezuelan Republicans only retained the island of Margarita. By that point, Bolivar had returned to New Granada, but not before issuing a message to his fellow Republicans. Quote, "I swear to you that, liberator or dead, I will strive to merit the honor you have conferred on me. There is no human power on the face of this earth that can impede the course I am determined to follow, until I have returned to liberate you by way of the West, covered in blood and laurels." Bolivar would sadly find problems awaiting him in New Granada as well, as Spanish forces were working to retake that nation, while rebel forces had driven the Congress of the Confederation from Bogota. Leaders in Bogota had soured on the regime that had supported Bolivar to the point that the general had been excommunicated by the Archbishop of that city. On December 12, 1814, however, after a few short months of trying to shore up control of key points in New Granada, Bolivar entered Bogota, and the Congress returned to the capital. 1815 would find the Spanish finally freed of the Napoleonic regime and the Peninsular War, sending 14,000 troops to South America to retake their breakaway colonies, starting with Venezuela. The cause of independence seemed to be dwindling. Further, the one stable republic in the Western Hemisphere, the United States, did not seem to be coming to their rescue, as President Madison had issued a proclamation on September 1st forbidding American citizens from supporting independence movements against Spain. Bolivar kept the faith, however, and did all he could to shore up support through letters and essays, including what would come to be known as the Letter from Jamaica, for Bolivar had surrendered his command on May 8th and fled to Jamaica to regroup and recover. By the end of 1815, Bolivar knew that, if independence was to be achieved, he would need allies. Thus, he went to Haiti, or, to be more accurate, the Republic of Haiti, on the southwestern side of Hispaniola. By New Year's Day 1816, Bolivar was in the capital city, Port-au-Prince, and was presented to the President of Haiti, Alexandre Pétion. Due to the American government's lack of formal engagement with the governments of Haiti, it's been since episode 4.17 that we've actually discussed what was happening there. As a reminder, what is now the modern-day Haiti was divided into two nations, the Republic of Haiti, which was everything from Port-au-Prince south, and the Kingdom of Haiti, which was ruled over by King Henri I. Beyond just that he had contacts who were based in Port-au-Prince, it's understandable why, ideologically, Bolivar would be more aligned with Pétion's government. Pétion offered his support for Bolivar's cause, but with a caveat. Bolivar offered to make sure that Pétion was given the credit for South American independence, but Pétion replied, "No, don't mention my name. My only desire is to see that those who tremble under slavery's yoke are free. Liberate my brothers, and that will be payment enough." Now, you can imagine, dear listener, how enslavers in the United States may be concerned about this alignment with a government controlled by liberated, enslaved individuals. The Madison administration was already trying to do what it could to temper enthusiasm and American support for the Latin American revolutionary movements, given their attempts to smooth out relations with Spain, as discussed in the last couple of episodes. In January 1816, a bill had been introduced that was backed by the administration, quote, that would have imposed harsh penalties on American citizens who sold ships to known belligerents against Spain. When Bolivar set sail on March 31st from Haiti with, quote, an army of black Haitians, and landed on the remaining Venezuelan Republican stronghold of Margarita on May 2nd, he was ready to live up to his promise to Pétion. Thus, on June 2, 1816, Bolivar issued a decree, quote, declaring absolute freedom for Spanish America's slaves. The news of this reached the American South around the same time that news of new slave insurrections was circulating. A massive uprising of enslaved individuals had been launched on British-held Barbados on Easter Sunday, April 14, 1816, with the freedom fighters gaining control of a third of the island within hours. However, the island's senior military officer, with the aid of formerly enslaved individuals from the American South who had been recruited into the British Army in the 1st West Indian Regiment, was able to gain control of the situation and overcome the 400-strong rebel force. Even closer to home, however, was what has been dubbed the Camden Slave Conspiracy. As described by historian Tim Lockley, quote, Camden was a fairly unremarkable place, one of a number of smaller interior towns in South Carolina. The area had experienced considerable growth since 1800, with a large number of cotton plantations being established in the course of a decade and a half. With that, however, the enslaved population of the town had increased significantly, to the point that the enslaved population would outnumber the white population of the town in the 1820 census. At some point in early to mid-1816, enslaved individuals in the area had decided to seek their freedom by force. But before they could carry out their plan, an enslaved individual named Scipio reported the plot to his enslaver, who happened to be closely aligned with the governor of South Carolina, David R. Williams. After consulting with Williams, his enslaver convinced Scipio, quote, to integrate himself into the plotters' inner circle and pass on every detail of the plot. Then, on July 1st, the trap was sprung, and 17 of the plot's leaders, quote, were arrested simultaneously as they worked in the fields by coordinated parties of white men. In order to keep up the illusion, Scipio was arrested alongside the others. But after testifying in 3 of the 10 trials carried out from July 3rd to July 17th, he knew that, while he did not want to leave, the enslaved population in the area, quote, would not let him live there. Thus, for his service, the state of South Carolina paid the enslaver $1,100 for Scipio's freedom, and then paid Scipio a pension of $50 annually to, quote, continue to reside on the chestnut plantation as a secret freeman. Supposedly, the plot involved the conspirators starting a fire on one end of Camden, away from the local arsenal, in order to draw the public's attention there, while the freedom fighters broke into the arsenal and acquired the weapons they needed to take on local authorities and militia forces. Ultimately, 7 of the folks who had initially been arrested were released without a trial, while, quote, 2 were tried but acquitted, and 2 were convicted but not executed. That left 6 more who were sentenced to be executed by hanging. One of those sentenced, named Stephen, was, according to Lockley, quote, convicted solely on the testimony of Scipio, and was also, quote, the only defendant to produce his own witness to testify on his behalf. The court, in a reversal, ordered a pardon of Stephen, quote, after all the ceremonies of execution had been made on the gallows. Thus, though he was spared death, Stephen was made to be frightened for his life before learning that he would not share the fate of his 5 compatriots. While the Camden insurrection and learning of Bolivar's alliance with Haiti would not completely sour Southerners on supporting independence movements in Latin America, it would start to shift viewpoints on the matter, as we'll see when we get into the next presidency. For we should remember that 1816 was a presidential election year. We discussed James Monroe's narrow victory in the Democratic-Republican Congressional Caucus last episode. So now, let's turn to the other side of the political spectrum, the Federalist. As noted by historian Lynn Turner, quote, there is no record of a Federalist caucus having been held in Washington, nor was there any agreement upon a candidate among Federalist newspapers. Thus, it would come as a surprise to everyone, including the apparent Federalist candidate, Senator Rufus King of New York, that he received 34 electoral votes in the election. Funny enough, King earlier in the year played a role in the debate over proposed legislation to change the way presidents were elected. Senator Joseph Bradley Varnum, Democratic-Republican from Massachusetts, had put forward a bill which proposed, quote, to divide each state into electoral districts for the choice of both representatives to Congress and electors of the president and vice president. With King Caucus, as the congressional caucus nominating system would be dubbed, full in force, this proposal naturally aroused much discussion, with folks who felt they had much to lose with this change staunch opponents of Varnum's bill. King, however, was a supporter of Varnum's bill, arguing that, quote, in conformity with the original view of the authors of the Constitution, I would restore as thoroughly as possible the freedom of election to the people. I would make the mode of election uniform through the country by throwing the whole nation into as many districts as there are electors, and let the people of each district choose one elector. Then all the people of the country would stand precisely on the same footing. As we know, Varnum's proposal would go nowhere, and thus, in the election of 1816, we get the same hodgepodge of methods of choosing electors that we've seen to date. The states of Kentucky, Maryland, and Tennessee chose their electors by the method proposed by Varnum, while 7 other states chose their electors by the winner-take-all popular vote-by-state method that most of our states utilize nowadays, 2025 as of this recording. The remaining 9 states allowed their state legislatures to choose the electors by majority vote, all or nothing. It would be from 3 of these 9 states, Connecticut, Delaware, and Massachusetts, that Rufus King would earn his 34 electoral votes. The vice presidential votes on the Federalist side would be split between 4 candidates. Former Senator John Eager Howard of Maryland received the most votes, 22 electoral votes, for Massachusetts, while former Senator James Ross of Pennsylvania received 5 votes. Supreme Court Chief Justice John Marshall received 4 votes, and Senator Robert Goodloe Harper of Maryland received the 3 electoral votes of neighboring Delaware. King himself does not seem to have had any idea that he was even a candidate in the election based on his correspondence that has been retained to the present day. But it appears that, given his position in the political schema and the esteem that he had been able to achieve in his career, quote, Rufus King was the only candidate still acceptable to Federalists throughout the nation, though even New York Federalists had done nothing on his behalf in the campaign. We'll explore the ramifications of this collapse of a coordinated Federalist Party as an entity on the national level in the Monroe Presidency series. But just know that, with 183 electoral votes, James Monroe was elected as the 5th President of the United States, while his running mate, Daniel D. Tompkins of New York, was elected as Vice President. This election cycle, however, would not be just about electing a new president. It would be about checking what was perceived as congressional overreach. Since the first Congress began its first session back in 1789, senators, representatives, and territorial delegates have been compensated for their work in Congress by being paid on a per diem basis, or by day. At $6 a day, that had been tough enough on representatives from the original 13 states to travel to New York or Philadelphia during the first Congress. In 1816, with some congressmen coming to Washington, D.C. from as far away as Louisiana, and an increasing number having to cross the Appalachian Mountains to get to the nation's capital. If Congress was only meeting for a short session, that was a tough ask financially for folks to come all that way at great personal expense for such small compensation. Thus, it should come as no surprise that Representative Richard M. Johnson, Democratic-Republican from Kentucky, rose to complain that he felt that, quote, House business dragged on interminably because the representatives stretched out each session as long as possible since they were paid by the day. Speaker of the House Henry Clay assigned a committee to look into the matter, and they brought before the House a bill to change the method of congressional compensation to a per annum or annual salary of $1,500. Clay, as Speaker, would receive twice that amount under the proposed bill. While it may sound like a sensible cost of living raise to many of us in the 21st century, there are a sizable number of people in the House and Senate who realize the potential political fallout from this bill, and though personally they supported it, they would vote against it. Henry Clay, however, came out publicly in support of it, and thus, in March 1816, the bill passed through the House and the Senate and became law. The problem, however, was that 1816 was an election year for the entire House and a third of the Senate. And as the bill's detractors had predicted, the Compensation Act, or as some dubbed it, the salary grab, was not well received back at home. Even Clay had to go back home and actively campaign for his reelection, managing to hang on to his seat by only a few hundred votes. Others of his colleagues were not so lucky. 2/3 of the House and half of the senators up for reelection were denied another term, with even some who had voted against the Compensation Act still being turned out in the backlash. Thus, it should come as no surprise when the lame duck session of Congress began, Henry Clay delivered a speech to the House calling for the repeal of the Compensation Act. Soon enough, in January 1817, the act was repealed and replaced with a much smaller $8 per diem raise for Congress. This last session of Congress for President Madison was not just about retreating from reform, but it was becoming clear that new leaders would be needed to carry it forward. After advocating for and seeing through the passage of the Tariff of 1816 in late April, the first U.S. protective tariff which, quote, established duties of 25% on woolen and cotton goods and 30% on iron goods, as well as beginning the work of establishing the new Bank of the United States, Secretary of the Treasury Alexander J. Dallas decided that the time had come to resign from his post. As you can learn more about in his Seat at the Table episode, besides just how much of a heavy lift it had been for Dallas in his 2-year tenure to bring the nation back from the brink of financial collapse and begin to reestablish a firm economic standing, he also faced some health issues that necessitated his retirement. And indeed, a few months after leaving office, Dallas passed away on January 16, 1817, at the age of 57. Luckily for Madison, Dallas had a recommendation for his replacement. His cabinet colleague, who was at the time serving as Secretary of War, William H. Crawford of Georgia. As we learned in Crawford's Seat at the Table episode, he was initially reluctant to take up the post and worried that he might be accused of, quote, the foolish vanity of wishing to fill all the major departments. There was also the fact that, in less than a year, there would be a new president in charge who might not want to be stuck with a Treasury Secretary that he didn't pick. Given the close relationship between Madison and Monroe and the likelihood of the latter's election, we can safely assume that the president didn't make the offer without consulting with his heir apparent. Crawford finally gave in to a conditional acceptance if Henry Clay was willing to step into the position of Secretary of War when he moved over to Treasury. Given the stiff competition that Clay was facing in his reelection bid, it's not out of the realm of possibility that he might be interested in securing a just-in-case backup plan or a guaranteed job, at least for the time being. Nothing doing, though. Clay sent word that he was not interested. Given that Crawford had indicated his preference to remain at the War Department if Clay refused to succeed him, Madison turned to a backup plan and offered Treasury to Representative William Lowndes, Democrat-Republican from South Carolina. Even as late as October 9th, Crawford was expressing his desire to stay at the War Department. But when word arrived that Lowndes had refused the appointment, and with the encouragement of Dallas, Crawford agreed to the appointment, and on October 20th, 1816, became the 7th U.S. Secretary of the Treasury in a recess appointment that was soon after confirmed when the Senate came back into session. This move to Treasury would position Crawford to play an elevated role in the American political schema than he likely would have been able to achieve had he remained at the War Department. But we'll have to wait to see how that plays out. If you'd like to skip ahead in the story and find out more, I encourage you to check out the 3-part Seat at the Table episode on Crawford. For now, though, let us continue with the latter days of Madison's presidency and the work of the new leaders emerging. John C. Calhoun is a name that has already come up a few times and, spoiler alert, is going to come up a great deal more as we move forward. In the lame duck congressional session of late 1816, early 1817, despite the backlash over the Compensation Act that he had supported, and had to fend off a challenge from his own cousin in order to retain his seat, Calhoun remained focused on the idea of progress. Indeed, it seemed like he wasn't alone, as the president himself had, in his 8th and final annual message to Congress, called, quote, their attention to the expediency of exercising their existing powers and, where necessary, of resorting to the prescribed mode of enlarging them in order to effectuate a comprehensive system of roads and canals, such as will have the effect of drawing more closely together every part of our country by promoting intercourse and improvements and by increasing the share of every part in the common stock of national prosperity. Calhoun, along with other leaders in Washington, took this as a clarion call to figure out a way to devise a system of internal improvements. And given that the federal government had to figure out what to do with a surplus of funds that they were guaranteed as a shareholder in the new national bank, in mid-December, he pushed for, quote, a committee that would examine using this revenue as a permanent fund for internal improvement. Before long, this committee reported out a bill along those lines to facilitate the construction of canals and roads to the benefit of the nation. As Calhoun remarked in a speech in support of the bill, quote, many of the improvements contemplated are on too great a scale for the resources of the states or individuals. Indeed, as we've seen in this podcast, going back to George Washington and his efforts with the Potomac Company looking to build a canal to link the Chesapeake with the Ohio River Basin, we see the truth in Calhoun's sentiments. It seemed at long last that the United States could build the transportation infrastructure that would facilitate the continental nation that they hoped to become. And though it would be by a narrow margin, the bill passed in the House by a vote of 86 to 84. The Senate likewise would give its assent to the bill, and thus it passed to Madison's desk for his signature. Given his remarks in his annual address, the president's approval was seen as a formality. But, and yes, there's always a but. On March 2nd, Calhoun called on the Madisons at their rented townhome at Pennsylvania Avenue and 19th Street as they prepared to enter retirement to congratulate them on a fruitful public career. The president called the representative back for a private conversation. Madison was going to veto Calhoun's bonus bill, as it was being dubbed. Calhoun didn't understand. Wasn't this exactly what Madison had asked for, being delivered to him on a silver platter? There had been no indication from the administration prior to this that the bill would not go through. And here, at the 11th hour, the rug was being ripped out from underneath them? Henry Clay even went to bat and begged Madison to leave the matter to his successor, who he hoped would be more open to the idea of internal improvements. Nothing doing, though. Madison insisted on vetoing the bill. In his veto message of March 3rd, Madison asserted that, quote, I am not unaware of the great importance of roads and canals and the improved navigation of watercourses, and that a power in the national legislature to provide for them might be exercised with signal advantage to the general prosperity. But seeing that such a power is not expressly given by the Constitution, and believing that it cannot be deduced from any part of it without an inadmissible latitude of construction and a reliance on insufficient precedents, I have no option but to withhold my signature from it. There was, of course, a remedy that the man who would come to be dubbed the father of the Constitution knew all too well. An amendment to grant Congress the authority to allocate funds for internal improvement projects would solve everything. Except the bill had barely made it out of the House. There was more support in the Senate for it, but there was certainly not the political will in a lame duck Congress to push through a constitutional amendment. For his part, Clay attempted to have the House override the veto, but he fell far short of the two-thirds majority required. For the time being, the cause of internal improvements floundered. To be fair to Madison, and as noted by Calhoun biographer Robert Elder, one aspect of the bonus bill that particularly concerned the president was the fact that the legislation did not specify projects that would be funded by the appropriation. As Elder notes, Madison saw this as, quote, too open an invitation to patronage and graft. We'll have to see as we go on the implications of Madison's veto of this bill, but for now, we need to wrap up Madison's tenure as president. For decades, the Madisons, James and Dolly both, had been at the heart of the American political scene. They formed as a powerhouse couple during the Washington administration, and now, in March 1817, they were preparing to go into retirement. The ensuing decades had been far from a smooth road for them. Shut out of power during the Federalist ascendancy, their backing of Jefferson and the so-called Revolution of 1800 had brought them back into the limelight. Madison had faced down contenders in 2 presidential elections and led the nation through various wars and conflicts, as well as a national economic crisis. On March 4, 1817, however, James's political career came to a quiet end as he handed over the reins of power to his chosen successor, and he and Dolly prepared to settle into retirement. As we will learn in our next episode, however, Madison's post-presidency would not necessarily be a quiet one. Special thanks to Alex from the Vice Presidency Special Series, Greg from Popular History, and Cody from Imperfect Men for providing the intro quotes for this episode. Be sure to check out all their podcasts on your podcast app of choice once you're done with this episode. Trust me, you'll be glad you did. Thanks to the folks at the Colonial Music Institute at George Washington's Mount Vernon that graciously allowed us the use of clips from Hull's Victory as performed by David and Ginger Hildebrand for our intro and outro music. You can find out more about the great work that the Colonial Music Institute is doing to research and share information about early American music and dance by going to mountvernon.org and typing in Colonial Music Institute in the search field. I'll have links to all these available on my website, presidenciespodcast.com. There you can also find sources used in this episode, past episodes of the podcast, and links to much more information about all of the American presidents. You can also find out how you, yes, you, dear listener, can help to support the Presidency's podcast. Whether it's through a rating and review, or if you sign up as a patron of the podcast at patreon.com/presidencies, I cannot thank you enough for your support. Please feel free to reach out to me via email with any questions or comments at presidenciespodcast@gmail.com. You can also connect with me on social media if you're not already. I'm available on Facebook, Blue Sky, and Mastodon as Presidencies, on the formerly known as Twitter at Presidencies89, and on Instagram and Threads as Presidencies Podcast. Last, but certainly not least, I thank you so much for listening. It has been my absolute pleasure to have you on this journey through the Madison presidency with me, and I hope you'll continue on as we wrap up this series and move on to learn about the presidency of James Monroe. Until next time, stay safe and healthy, be kind to one another, and take care, dear friends.